Tonight, I will become a stranger in my own world, and see who still looks at me the same way when I am nothing." The words hung in the air of the top-floor suite of the Harrington Tower, overlooking Manhattan, where the lights stretched like endless constellations beneath a glass horizon. William Harrington stood by the window in a tailored suit worth more than most people's annual salary. Yet tonight, he felt none of it mattered. He loosened his tie slightly, not out of discomfort, but as if preparing to shed a version of himself. Behind him, the city pulsed with life, taxi lights moving like veins of gold, helicopters cutting through the cold New York air, the distant hum of a city that never learned how to sleep. This was not a business decision. It was a test of something far more fragile than money. Trust, loyalty, truth. Downstairs, in the heart of the city's most exclusive rooftop restaurant, Sophie Miller was already there, laughing softly at something an investor had whispered into her ear. She wore elegance like it was effortless, a champagne glass resting between perfectly manicured fingers, her attention drifting between conversations that all seemed to orbit wealth. She had no idea that the man she believed she knew was about to erase himself from her version of reality. William watched her through the private surveillance feed on his tablet, expression unreadable. Not anger, not sadness, something colder. Curiosity sharpened by doubt. He had built companies, negotiated billion-dollar mergers, and survived boardrooms where loyalty was measured in silence. But none of that prepared him for the thought that love might not be immune to the same calculations. A soft knock came at the door. Emily Parker stepped in quietly, holding a tray she wasn't scheduled to carry. She had been working the floor for less than a year, long enough to understand the invisible rules of places like this. Smile, stay efficient, never interrupt the world of people who don't notice you exist. But something about tonight felt different to her too. The air carried tension she couldn't name, like a storm still far away but already pressing against the windows. William turned, slightly, observing her for a moment longer than necessary. She did not flinch under attention the way most people did in his presence. She simply waited, patient, grounded, as if silence itself was not uncomfortable to her. "What do you see when you look at that room?" he asked finally, his voice calm but deliberate. Emily hesitated, then answered carefully. "People trying very hard not to be forgotten." A faint pause followed, one that lingered just long enough to feel heavier than words. William's gaze returned to the city below, where everything looked beautiful from a distance, even things that were breaking. Sophie's laughter flickered again on the screen, brighter this time, directed at someone wearing a watch too expensive to ignore. William's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, not with jealousy, but with recognition. The kind that arrives when a question you avoided finally starts answering itself. He closed the tablet slowly. "Then let's see what remains when nothing is certain anymore," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. And in that moment, somewhere between the silence of a luxury suite and the noise of a city that never paused for reflection, the experiment had already begun, though no one in that rooftop restaurant below would understand yet that they were part of it. The rooftop restaurant on the 62nd floor of Manhattan shimmered under a canopy of soft golden light, where crystal chandeliers cast slow-moving reflections across marble floors polished to perfection. From above, the city looked like a living circuit board, pulsing with ambition, wealth, and silent competition. Inside, every table was occupied by people who spoke in measured tones, as if even laughter had a price tag. Sophie Miller sat near the center of the main lounge, her posture relaxed but deliberate, as she leaned slightly toward a venture capitalist who had already mentioned his portfolio twice in under 10 minutes. She smiled at the right moments, nodded at the right pauses, and played the role of effortless charm with the precision of someone who understood exactly what kind of room she was in. Across the room, unnoticed by most, Emily Parker moved between tables with quiet consistency, balancing trays and conversations she was never part of. She had learned early that in places like this, invisibility was not an accident, it was a requirement. Yet tonight felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself carried an expectation no one had spoken aloud. In the service corridor just beyond the dining floor, William Harrington stood in a darker uniform without insignia, blending into the background of his own empire. To anyone watching casually, he looked like temporary staff, a manager assisting with an unusually busy evening. Only a few senior employees knew better, and even they avoided drawing attention to him. He observed everything without interruption, his presence quiet but absolute, like pressure beneath calm water. Sophie laughed again, slightly louder this time, her attention shifting toward a man seated across from her wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a confident smile that seemed practiced rather than natural. William noticed the shift instantly. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not trained to see patterns instead of moments. But to him, it registered like a deviation in a system he had assumed was stable. Emily approached the edge of the dining floor, pausing briefly as she adjusted the placement of a glass that had been moved slightly off-center. It was a small action, almost meaningless, but she did it with care, as if order itself mattered more than anyone noticed. William's gaze followed her movement briefly. There was something unpolished yet steady about her presence, not nervous, not performative, simply grounded. He spoke quietly without turning his head fully toward her. "Do you notice anything unusual about that table near the center?" Emily followed his gaze carefully, taking a moment before answering. "She is adjusting her attention more often than before," she said softly, choosing her words with caution. "It looks like she is trying to decide between two different versions of the same conversation." William did not respond immediately. The observation was simple, yet precise in a way most people would miss. Downstairs, Sophie leaned closer to the venture capitalist. Her laughter now more engaged, her body language shifting in a direction that suggested comfort replacing restraint. William's expression remained unchanged, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Not anger, not yet, but clarity forming in real time. Emily noticed the change in his silence and instinctively remained still, as if even movement might interrupt a thought that had not fully arrived. The room continued its rhythm of glass clinks, soft conversations, and distant laughter, unaware that the structure of what they were part of was no longer static. Somewhere between observation and realization, the test had begun to reveal itself, not through action, but through pattern. And in that pattern, something was already beginning to break, quietly, without anyone in the room, yet understanding that they were being measured as much as they believed they were simply living. The night at the rooftop restaurant had begun to settle into a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic, where conversations rose and fell like waves, and every gesture carried a quiet expectation of being noticed by the right person. Sophie Miller sat comfortably in the center of that illusion, her presence carefully calibrated between warmth and ambition, as she tilted her head slightly, while listening to the venture capitalist across from her describe a future investment fund that sounded impressive enough to hold attention, but vague enough to invite admiration. She laughed again, softly, just enough to signal alignment, while her fingers traced the stem of her wine glass with a practiced ease that suggested she had long understood the language of rooms like this. Across from her, the man she was speaking to leaned in slightly, his confidence measured, his tone smooth, as if every word had already been approved by success. In the background, Emily Parker moved with quiet precision between tables, her steps light but deliberate, adjusting silverware and replacing glasses with the kind of attention that rarely earned recognition but often prevented disorder. She had noticed something earlier in the evening, a subtle shift in Sophie's attention, not sudden, but gradual, like a conversation drifting away from its original anchor. Emily had learned not to judge what she saw, but to observe it carefully, because in rooms like this, appearances were often designed to hide intent rather than reveal it. In the private service corridor just beyond the dining floor, William Harrington remained still, his posture relaxed but his attention fully engaged, as if the entire room existed within a framework only he could see clearly. He did not look like a man participating in an evening event anymore, but rather someone quietly mapping behavior patterns that others would dismiss as coincidence. Sophie's laughter reached him faintly through the open archway, and with it came another small detail, the way her gaze now lingered slightly longer on the man across from her, as though recalibrating her perception of value in real time. Emily stepped closer to William's position without announcing her presence, her movements careful, respectful of the silence he seemed to prefer. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the distance between observation and understanding felt thinner than before. William finally spoke in a low, controlled voice, not looking away from the room. Tell me what changes when people believe they are being chosen instead of tested. Emily considered the question, her eyes still on the dining floor. They stop noticing who is watching, she replied quietly, and start performing for who they think matters. William's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not in surprise, but in confirmation. Downstairs, Sophie leaned in closer to her companion, her smile widening slightly as the conversation turned toward opportunity and influence, the kind of topics that rarely required truth to sound convincing. The man opposite her responded with equal ease, his confidence steady, his gestures measured, as if he had long mastered the art of appearing indispensable. William watched without interruption, absorbing every detail with the patience of someone waiting for a system to reveal its flaw. Emily noticed the subtle tightening in his posture, a shift so small it would have gone unseen by anyone less attentive. The atmosphere of the room remained unchanged on the surface, elegant, composed, and polished, but beneath it, something quieter was unfolding, a gradual exposure of intention through behavior. And in that silence between words, where no one yet realized they were being understood more deeply than they intended, the distance between illusion and truth continued to narrow, unnoticed by everyone except those who had learned how to listen without being heard. The evening had deepened into a more controlled stillness, where the rooftop restaurant no longer felt like a gathering of strangers, but like a carefully maintained illusion of harmony. Glass reflections softened under the warm lighting, and conversations flowed with the kind of ease that only existed when everyone believed they were in control of how they were perceived. Sophie Miller continued to occupy the center of her conversation, her expression smooth and composed, yet something subtle had begun to shift in her rhythm. Her responses came slightly faster now, her laughter a fraction more deliberate, as if she were adjusting herself to match an invisible standard she felt but could not name. Across from her, the venture capitalist maintained his confident posture, speaking in confident phrases about expansion, partnerships, and opportunity, his voice steady in a way that suggested he was accustomed to being agreed with rather than questioned. Emily Parker moved through the space with the same quiet precision as before, but her attention had sharpened. She had begun to notice patterns rather than isolated actions, small inconsistencies that did not belong to the surface elegance of the room. Sophie's eyes lingered on her phone slightly longer between replies. The man across from her adjusted his cufflink twice within a short span of time, a gesture that suggested unconscious self-awareness rather than confidence. In the service corridor, William Harrington remained still, his presence blending into the architecture of the building while his attention remained fully active, like a system running beneath visible reality. He observed Sophie's shifting cadence, not as emotion, but as data forming structure. Emily stood nearby, her posture respectful, yet her silence carried the weight of someone who had begun to understand that she was witnessing something unfolding beneath ordinary social behavior. William finally broke the silence again, his voice low and measured. People do not usually reveal themselves all at once, he said calmly. They reveal themselves in interruptions of consistency. Emily glanced toward the dining floor, then back toward him. Then the question is not what they say, she replied, but what they repeat when they think no one is counting. William's eyes remained fixed forward, his expression unchanged, but something in his focus tightened, as if her words had aligned precisely with what he was already calculating. Downstairs, Sophie laughed again, but this time the sound carried a slight delay, as if it arrived after she had already decided it was appropriate. The man across from her leaned in, speaking with quiet assurance about exclusivity and timing, phrases that suggested access to things most people would never reach. Sophie nodded, but her attention briefly drifted again, this time toward another table where a different conversation carried a more relaxed confidence. William noticed it instantly, not the direction of her gaze alone, but the pattern behind it, the recalibration of interest based on perceived value. Emily followed his line of sight and quietly observed the same shift, her understanding forming without commentary. The restaurant continued its performance of elegance, untouched by the underlying awareness building in the service corridor. But within William's silence, there was no longer uncertainty. There was only confirmation forming layer by layer, as if the room below was slowly revealing its structure without realizing it was being read. And in that growing clarity, the evening continued forward, unaware that the most important change was not in what was being said, but in what could no longer remain hidden within how it was said. The night had begun to shift into a quieter tension, where the surface elegance of the rooftop restaurant no longer felt entirely stable, as if something beneath it was gradually changing its weight. Conversations continued in soft waves, but the rhythm of the room had subtly altered, becoming more calculated, more aware, though no one could explain why. Sophie Miller remained seated at her table, her posture still composed, yet her expression had begun to reflect a growing need to maintain control over how she was being perceived. Her laughter came at precise moments, slightly delayed, as if she were responding not to emotion but to expectation. The venture capitalist across from her continued speaking, his tone smooth and confident, but now his words seemed to carry less influence than before, as if the space between them was quietly widening. Emily Parker moved through the dining area with careful steps, her attention no longer limited to tasks but extending into observation. She noticed how Sophie's focus drifted more frequently toward other tables, how her smile tightened briefly before resetting, how small pauses began to appear in her responses where none existed before. In the service corridor, William Harrington stood with unchanged posture, but his stillness now felt different, less like observation and more like conclusion forming in real time. He no longer watched the room as a collection of individuals, but as a system revealing its internal logic through inconsistency. Emily stood near him, sensing the shift even without instruction, her voice quieter than before when she spoke. "She is adjusting herself more often," she said, referring to Sophie without naming her directly. "It is no longer natural reaction. It is calibration." William did not respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the dining floor, where Sophie had just smiled again at something said by a man at a nearby table, a smile that lasted slightly too long to be effortless. "Calibration only happens when there is fear of being evaluated," William finally said, his tone calm, almost detached. Emily nodded slightly, as if confirming something she had already begun to understand. Downstairs, Sophie shifted in her seat, her attention moving again, this time toward the edge of the room where another guest group appeared more relaxed, their conversation less structured, their laughter less rehearsed. The venture capitalist noticed her distraction and adjusted his tone, speaking with slightly more emphasis, as if trying to reclaim presence that was slowly slipping. Sophie responded, but her focus did not fully return. William observed the exchange without interruption. There was no expression of judgment on his face, only recognition of a pattern completing itself. Emily followed his gaze again, her understanding growing clearer, though unspoken. "She is not choosing based on connection," she said quietly. "She is choosing based on positioning." William's answer came after a short pause. "Most people do," he said. The words were not critical, but observational, as if describing a constant rather than a flaw. Sophie's attention shifted once more, this time lingering slightly longer on a different table where influence felt less visible but more stable. The venture capitalist across from her continued speaking, but the space between his words and her attention had begun to widen in a way that could no longer be bridged through conversation alone. Emily noticed the change in Sophie's breathing pattern, subtle but present, a sign not of distress but of recalculation happening beneath surface composure. The restaurant remained unchanged in appearance, glowing under its warm lighting, filled with carefully maintained elegance. Yet within William's perspective, the structure of interaction had already begun to reveal its hierarchy in motion. Nothing had been spoken aloud that confirmed the shift, yet everything had begun to move differently around it. And in that silent transition, where awareness replaced assumption without announcement, the evening continued forward, carrying within it the quiet formation of truth that had not yet been acknowledged by those still performing within it. The atmosphere in the rooftop restaurant had begun to feel subtly different, as if the balance that had held the evening together was no longer stable in the same way. Conversations still flowed, glasses were still lifted, and polite laughter still filled the air, but beneath it all, something quieter and more deliberate was beginning to surface. Sophie Miller sat at her table with the same outward composure, Yet the ease that had once defined her presence now carried a slight hesitation, as if each reaction required a brief internal calculation before being expressed. Her attention continued to shift between the venture capitalist in front of her and the surrounding tables, and with each shift, her responses became more carefully timed, less instinctive, more aware of how she might be perceived from a distance rather than in the moment. Across from her, the man maintained his confidence, speaking in steady, controlled phrases about opportunity and alignment. Yet there was an almost invisible strain beneath his certainty, as if he too had begun to sense that his influence was no longer fully anchoring the interaction. Emily Parker moved through the dining floor with quiet precision, but her observation had deepened into something more structured. She was no longer simply noticing behavior. She was recognizing rhythm, repetition, and deviation. Sophie's laughter now arrived slightly after the moment that triggered it. Her gaze briefly checked the reaction of others before settling into expression, and her posture shifted in subtle ways that suggested adjustment rather than comfort. In the service corridor, William Harrington remained still, his presence unchanged in form but entirely different in focus. He no longer viewed the room as a social environment, but as a layered structure of intention and response, where meaning was revealed not in words but in timing. Emily stood near him, her voice low, almost careful, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the clarity forming in front of them. "She is no longer reacting," Emily said quietly. "She is managing perception." William did not immediately respond. His eyes remained fixed on Sophie's table, where she had just adjusted her hair slightly before smiling again at the venture capitalist, a smile that appeared correct but not entirely present. "Management of perception always appears when internal certainty weakens," William said finally, his tone even and controlled. Downstairs, Sophie leaned slightly forward, listening, then glanced briefly toward another table where conversation seemed more effortless, more socially fluid. The shift was small, but noticeable when viewed with continuity rather than isolation. The venture capitalist continued speaking, unaware that his words were now competing with something less visible but more influential: attention redistribution. Emily noticed it clearly now. Sophie was no longer anchored to a single interaction. Her focus was dispersing, recalibrating across multiple perceived sources of value, as if unconsciously measuring which presence in the room held greater long-term significance. William's expression did not change, but his silence carried a sense of completion forming beneath it, as though the experiment had already begun to answer itself without requiring further intervention. The restaurant maintained its polished surface, its controlled lighting and refined atmosphere unchanged, yet within William's perspective, the structure of the evening had already shifted from observation to revelation. And in that quiet unfolding, where every small adjustment carried more meaning than any spoken sentence, the room continued forward, unaware that what they believed was still a social evening had already become something far closer to a measured truth. The evening had reached a point where silence itself seemed to carry meaning, as if the room had slowly transitioned from social performance into quiet exposure. The rooftop restaurant still glowed with controlled elegance, but the rhythm inside it had shifted into something more fragile, where every gesture felt slightly more deliberate than before. Sophie Miller remained seated, yet her composure no longer carried the same effortless stability. Her movements were still refined, her posture still correct, but there was a growing sense that she was no longer simply participating in the moment. She was evaluating it continuously as it unfolded. Her attention moved between the venture capitalist and the surrounding tables with increasing frequency, and each return to the conversation felt less anchored than the one before. Across from her, the man continued speaking in steady, confident tones, describing future plans and strategic alignment, yet even his voice seemed to lose a degree of influence, as if the space between intention and reception had quietly expanded. Emily Parker had stopped moving entirely for a brief moment near the service corridor, her attention fixed on the dining floor with a clarity that had replaced her earlier caution. She no longer interpreted individual actions in isolation, but as part of a continuous pattern that had fully revealed itself. Sophie's laughter now appeared only after a short pause, her gaze briefly scanning the room before settling into expression, and her responses carried a subtle delay that made them feel less like reactions and more like adjustments. In that same stillness, William Harrington stood unmoving, his presence unchanged in form but absolute in focus. He no longer observed the room with curiosity, but with confirmation, as though every variable he had been tracking had now settled into its final state. Emily finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "She is no longer choosing based on what she feels in the moment," she said. "She is choosing based on how she believes she is being evaluated." William did not take his eyes off the dining floor. Sophie had just shifted slightly in her seat, her attention briefly moving toward another table where conversation appeared more relaxed, more naturally confident, without the structure she was currently maintaining. "When perception becomes the priority," William said quietly, "authenticity becomes secondary." Downstairs, Sophie's attention lingered again on that other table, just slightly longer than before, while the venture capitalist continued speaking, unaware that his words were now competing with a diminishing share of her focus. The imbalance was subtle, but no longer hidden. Emily observed it clearly now. Sophie was not drifting randomly. She was recalibrating continuously, as if each moment required reassessment of social value, connection strength, and perceived outcome. William's expression remained unchanged, yet the stillness around him carried a sense of finality, as if the system he had been observing had already completed its cycle. The restaurant maintained its visual perfection, its lighting unchanged, its atmosphere undisturbed, but within the structure of interaction, something irreversible had already occurred. And in that quiet realization, where every small shift had accumulated into undeniable pattern, the evening moved forward into its final stage, no longer uncertain, only fully revealed. The atmosphere inside the rooftop restaurant had shifted into a silence that was no longer accidental, but inevitable, as if the entire space had reached a point where nothing further needed to be added for meaning to be understood. Conversations continued in fragments, yet even those fragments felt thinner, as if the weight of attention had been redistributed without announcement. Sophie Miller sat still for a moment longer than usual, her expression carefully maintained, but something beneath it had begun to fracture in subtle ways. Her gaze, once fluid and socially adaptive, now paused too often between points of focus, as if each choice of attention required confirmation before being executed. The venture capitalist across from her was still speaking, his voice steady, his tone controlled, but there was a diminishing sense of authority in his words, not because he had changed, but because the way he was being received had already shifted. Emily Parker stood near the edge of the service corridor, no longer moving, her attention fixed entirely on the dining floor with a clarity that had replaced observation with understanding. She no longer interpreted behavior as separate moments, but as a completed pattern finally revealing its structure. Sophie's laughter came once more, but this time it arrived late, just slightly delayed, as if she had reviewed the situation internally before allowing the expression to appear. William Harrington remained in the same position he had occupied throughout the evening, yet the stillness around him now felt absolute, not as anticipation, but as conclusion. Emily spoke softly, her voice almost blending into the ambient noise of the room. "She is no longer participating naturally," she said. "She is responding based on comparison." William did not move his gaze. Sophie had shifted again, her attention drawn briefly to another table where conversation appeared more effortless, more stable, more naturally confident. The change was subtle, but it repeated a pattern already confirmed multiple times. "Comparison always weakens presence," William said quietly. Downstairs, Sophie adjusted her posture slightly, her smile returning at the appropriate moment, but the timing was no longer seamless. It felt constructed, assembled from awareness rather than instinct. The venture capitalist continued speaking, unaware that his influence in the conversation was now competing with an invisible recalibration happening in real time. Emily observed everything without interruption, her understanding now fully formed. Sophie was no longer anchored to connection, but to evaluation, continuously measuring the room as if searching for a more stable reference point. William's expression remained unchanged, but the finality in his silence had become unmistakable. The system he had been observing had reached its natural endpoint without requiring intervention. The restaurant maintained its visual perfection, its lighting unchanged, its atmosphere undisturbed. Yet beneath that surface, every interaction had already revealed its underlying structure. And in that moment of quiet completion, where nothing more needed to be said for truth to be fully visible, the evening moved forward into its final unfolding, no longer uncertain, only fully exposed. The final moments of the evening settled over the rooftop restaurant like a quiet suspension of time, where everything appeared unchanged on the surface, yet irreversible beneath it. The lighting remained warm, the glassware still reflected soft gold tones, and conversations continued in fragments that no longer held their earlier confidence. Sophie Miller sat motionless for a brief moment longer than before, her expression carefully composed, but the ease that once defined her presence had fully dissolved into something more controlled, more conscious, and less natural. Every glance she made now carried intention, every pause before response carried calculation, and every smile arrived only after confirmation rather than feeling. Across from her, the venture capitalist continued, speaking, but his voice no longer held its earlier influence in the space between them. The words were the same, the tone unchanged, yet the reception had shifted completely, as if the room itself had quietly reweighted its attention elsewhere. Emily Parker stood near the service corridor, no longer observing in parts, but understanding in full continuity. Her awareness now settled into certainty rather than interpretation. Sophie's attention shifted once more toward a distant table, lingered briefly, then returned to her conversation with a delay that no longer matched natural rhythm. William Harrington remained still, his presence unchanged, yet everything around him felt as if it had reached its final alignment. Emily spoke softly, almost without breaking the silence of the space. "It is finished," she said, not as a question but as recognition. William did not immediately respond, his gaze still directed toward the dining floor, where Sophie's composure held together in appearance but no longer in structure. "It was always going to finish this way," he said quietly after a pause, his voice steady and without emphasis. Downstairs, Sophie adjusted her posture one final time, her smile appearing at the correct moment, but it no longer carried the same effortless alignment it once had. The venture capitalist leaned slightly forward, speaking again, but the space between his words and her attention had become too wide to bridge through conversation alone. Emily watched without interruption, fully aware now that what she was witnessing was no longer change in progress, but change already completed. Sophie was no longer responding to the room as it was, but to how she believed the room would judge her, and in that shift, every interaction lost its original grounding. William finally turned slightly away from the view, his decision already made without announcement. The experiment had concluded not through declaration, but through exposure, as every pattern had revealed itself without resistance. The restaurant remained visually unchanged, its elegance intact, its atmosphere undisturbed, yet within its structure, every illusion of effortless connection had already dissolved into clarity. And as the evening reached its final stillness, nothing remained uncertain, nothing remained hidden, and nothing remained unmeasured. Only the quiet recognition that everything had already spoken for itself without needing to be said. True character isn't revealed when you're at the top. It's exposed when people think you have nothing left to offer. The illusion of loyalty has completely shattered, and without raising a single voice, the billionaire's silence has officially ended a deceptive empire. Sophie lost a king while chasing a temporary crown, and Emily, the quiet waitress, just opened the door to a world she never expected. But this is only the first layer of what happens when the elite get a brutal reality check. If you believe that silent integrity should always crush empty greed, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications. Don't stop watching. The next mind-blowing story of hidden wealth and a shocking boardroom revenge is already playing on your screen right now. Click on it immediately, because you won't believe what happens when another corrupt billionaire gets caught in his own trap. See you in the next video.